few more people. Yeah, so everyone has just had the warning. So Peter has kindly agreed that we will record this session. So if you're not happy with your face appearing on this, it will be shared on a web page at some point. If you're going to ask a question or interact, just turn your video off first, and then it's no problem. So welcome to Simulation-Based Science again. I'm Mike Lees. I'm one of the organizers for Simulation-Based Science, and today I'm really happy to introduce Peter Coveney. So Peter Coveney is Professor of Physical Chemistry at UCL and an Honorary Professor of Computer Science at UCL, and also a Professor within the UVA in the Computational Science Lab. And his career has been, well, very multidisciplinary, but looking at the use of high-performance computing and computer simulations in general to address questions from chemistry to all sorts of other domains as well. I think 2 years ago, Peter, you got the VECMA project, right? It's an EU project?
Yeah, that's correct.
And this VECMA project, part of it is looking at the idea of trusting simulations. So how do you build simulations that you can trust, where you can trust their answers, trust their solutions? And that coincided perfectly with the ongoing pandemic, where computational models and simulations have played a big role in policy. I think probably in my lifetime, one of the biggest roles that they've ever played in determining policy. And I think a month ago or so, Peter and a few others from the VECMA project released an article in Nature, or letter in Nature, that actually articulated these ideas about how to build trust in these simulations and how they can better inform policy. So we thought it would be a great topic for simulation-based science, and Peter kindly agreed to give a talk. And I think he's prepared a lecture of 30 to 40 minutes, and he wants to have kind of some vigorous discussions afterwards about the consequences for simulation in the current climate. So Peter, please go ahead.
Very good. And can you confirm you can hear and see me still?
Yeah, see the slide, see you, all works.
Great. So, Mike, thank you very much indeed. And in some respects, my face is very red because I haven't been able to go back to Amsterdam in the period since about March of last year, caused by this pandemic. And I'm really looking forward to the time when I can get back to be in these meetings. It looks like, Mike, you may well be sitting at the IAS, a great building, which I've enjoyed spending a lot of time in until that moment. I'm going to talk to you, as Mike said, about a range of issues to do with the credibility of computer simulations. This is part of the bigger picture, of course, in modern science as a hot topic of debate, which is about reproducibility in a way. This is also running even more widely than science itself, in the sense that it's become an agenda item for any kind of research. Can we rely on the way people are doing things? And while I'm not going to talk about the wider picture, we should remember we're situated in it. But those of us who do simulation are probably only too well aware of the challenges that exist for us in being able to make pronouncements that are credible, and the ease with which it's possible to criticize protocols and methods and the way we publish our work at the moment. So that's the bigger picture, and I do look forward to a discussion of these issues as we move along here. And I'm just going to give you an idea of the contents, but first quickly an acknowledgement of a number of the people who have worked with me that have impacted this presentation and contributed to it in various ways. And that's on this slide. I usually put this sort of thing, or people put them at the end of their talks, but I like to make sure I get this right up at the start. It's impossible for me to do any of my work without collaboration with others. And the bottom part of the slide does tell you about a theme issue in the journal called Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, Series A. That's forthcoming on the 29th of March. It's an issue entitled Reliability and Reproducibility in Computational Science, and I'm recommending you to look out for that. You can see a couple of good Dutch names you may recognize as co-editors there with me. Notice the logos on the right, and not only VECMA, an EU project, but the Comp Biomed Center of Excellence in High Performance Computing that I run is also featured. and the tie-up in the context of some of the biological and COVIDian problems is a really strong one between VECMA and Biomed, because in the long run, we're going to make actionable decisions in the biomedical space. They really need to be passing regulatory approvals, which must mean things like uncertainty, verification, and validation have been sorted out. And that's one of the things that entities like the EMA and the FDA are concerned with. So this is what I want to get through, and there's a lot here. So obviously I'm just going to skim over it. I know your canals were recently iced over, and that's what I intend to do, skate on thin ice here as I cover quite a lot of ground, and but I hope it will be sort of intellectually interesting, and we can discuss some of the topics in more detail if you want when we reach the discussion options towards the end of the presentation here. So yes, COVID-19, the pandemic, with Mike just ahead of this talk, I was discussing a couple of things, and he said to me, have you been doing any work with Neil Ferguson? And Neil Ferguson's name is right at the top of this slide. Neil Ferguson may be known to people here because he runs an MRC unit, which is on sort of things like infectious diseases and so on. And he produced a model which became very influential. I'm going to talk about that today. Neil Ferguson actually has his, I know he's become a bit of a celebrity in the UK in recent times. He has his DPhil from Oxford in string theory, but he then converted into the biomedical modeling space subsequent to that. So he's developed a model that was used for flu epidemics and had been publishing with that for a while. And then when the pandemic of COVID-19 erupted, he and his team sort of rapidly took that model and tweaked it in order to try and make it applicable to the COVID-19 pandemic. They were looking at issues around non-pharmaceutical interventions. Note that later on in this talk, I'm going to talk about pharmaceutical ones, because the issue of how we discover drugs as well as vaccines crops up there, but this type of work has nothing to do with that. The model turned out to be very influential, at least in the first half of last year in the UK. And I'm always looking as far as I can on an international basis. I'd be interested to hear if people in the Netherlands are conscious of national models in the Netherlands or other parts of Europe where models have been put forward that have actually been paid attention to by the government. That is what happened in the UK. So around February of last year, he published a paper. It wasn't actually in a journal, but a report 9, as it's called, and that's mentioned at the bottom of this slide deck, and which was indicating, mortality and healthcare demand, the risks to the health service and so on if we didn't get the infection and the pandemic under control. So that model was put forward, and the results, and some of which I will discuss, presented to the UK government in a scientific advisory group for epidemics and so on called SAGE, which he was a member of. And famously, modeling and simulation started to hit the national newspapers, and he and modeling were topics of great discussion. So Boris Johnson and his team paid attention to these things, and having taken a relatively lackadaisical approach to the pandemic, after his paper came out, of course, with some other things going on, they decided they better take the UK into its first lockdown. So one can argue this paper was quite influential in that respect. The story is interesting, again, from a wider perspective of reproducibility and so on, because it rapidly became clear that report 9, while that was open, was the openness of the work itself was hotly debated and contested, because neither the code nor any of the data was really easily available to scientists to assess and to check on. And actually, people became quite concerned about that for various reasons, one of which might also be bringing science into disrepute and so on if we were pronouncing things that may be incorrect in some way. So what actually happened is that the Royal Society of London set up a team, the RAMP team, which was to address questions around the pandemic, and they focused heavily on epidemiology and the modeling thereof. It was led by a guy called Mike Cates, who's known to me, and he's the Lucasian professor of mathematics actually at the University of Cambridge now. And he set this thing up, and he wanted to get a lot of people starting to do modeling and maybe simulation of epidemiology and to check on the validity of these models. And what's interesting there is that a number of people started playing around with the code after a while, because the pressure became intense on Neil Ferguson to actually put the code into the public domain. The first version of it was called something like IMP, as in the first syllable in Imperial College, and he was then persuaded to produce an open source version that in fact Microsoft had to refactor to make it quite sort of accessible and readable and so on. And it then got rolled out across all the UK, and the so-called tier 2 regional resources all got copies of the code for people to play with, so that we could actually assess it. And as part of that, I was asked by this team with Mike Cates to take a look at the uncertainty in the code. But people were very worried originally that this thing has a huge number of parameters in it. And if you're a theoretical physicist, as you may know from stories involving Freeman Dyson and Enrico Fermi, the idea that you have a model which has 4 parameters is bad enough, because if you have a 5th, I think it was von Neumann who said he could make that elephant that you are parameterizing twiddle its trunk. And therefore, we would have to go off and do different types of things. Well, today, complexity is dominated by mathematical models that are absolutely overflowing with parameters. And this model is no exception to that. But nobody actually knew how many parameters it had in it until we started analyzing it. It's important to understand the kind of model it is in computational terms. It's an individual-based model, so it's sort of related to agent-based models. It's relatively lightweight in terms of compute that I deal with, in the sense that you could run a single sort of sample or instance of this code on a single node, which typically could have 30 odd cores on it, and it would execute and finish in 10 minutes. And so indeed it mentions here the Eagle supercomputer, which we've used at Poznan Supercomputing and Network Center in Poland for this work. That's where we were doing it. So you can run one kind of instance of it relatively quickly, and that's important in terms of how quickly you can do the studies we are interested in. So we were interested in the sensitivity analysis, first of all, figuring out how many parameters there were, which ones might be influential, and the sensitivity of the code to them, and then performing uncertainty studies off the back of those. This slide tells you, what to a conventional and theoretical physicist sounds like absolutely terrible. And we did this through the software we've developed in the Vecna code, that because you can run essentially the model through an autoencoder and get the software called EasyVVUQ to spew out a listing of all the parameters. There are precisely 940 input parameters in this model. And that's a colossal number, but many of them would be deemed to be irrelevant because they are legacy, say, from the time when it was used for flu studies and so on. But it's so many that you can't do work like this if you're not familiar with the code unless you work with the creators of it, which is why I've been spending quite a bit of time in this period liaising with Neil Ferguson to get his assessment of what's going on in the code and what mattered. We were able to get to around 60 parameters, and roughly speaking, these are categorized as being these non-pharmaceutical interventions, the disease transmission parameters, and spatio-geographic inputs. So that means, roughly speaking, around 20 parameters in each of those categories were identified as the ones which are most important. Now, a model which has 20 parameters is already pretty large dimensional input space, and here we're talking about 60 or so. So we've got problems to address. What we were looking at initially was performing uncertainty quantification campaigns on this software that would be in each of those categories to identify the ones that mattered most from the three groups there, and then combining them to one final uncertainty quantification campaign, which in the end we had 19 input parameters. Once again, that's pretty high. So how do you deal with models of this size? I think in the work we've been doing before that in Vecna, for toy models and smaller things, people weren't getting to that size. And to go quickly through this, what we've done and implemented this is something Wouter Edeling was doing at CDI. This model pushed us very quickly into that, was to use dimension adaptive sampling, because a brute force method would be finished by the curse of dimensionality. I don't have the time to go into all the details of this now, but you start with one sample, you evaluate the code in the directions of which it could vary with the parameters that are in play, and find the error metric in all of those directions, and just then start evolving it in the direction with the highest error in the sampling plan and iterate this. And this scheme is much more computationally tractable and brings you into interesting territory. So what happened in the fallout from this is, with the 19 parameters that we were looking at for the combined model, actually, if you then perform these iterations to a level of convergence with the Sobel analysis we were doing with stochastic codification, you find that the effective dimension is actually only around 7. And the parameters, as it were, that matter most here are the ones listed at the top left here. I'm not going to read them all out, but quite a few of them are ones that are within our control, as it were, from a policy point of view, like social distancing. And then there's an interesting one there, which is household level compliance with the quarantine that's imposed, how many people actually follow the rules. And people here may know that Neil Ferguson himself fell foul of compliance and was forced to resign from the advisory panel because he didn't adhere to the rules that were imposed. So there's social distancing parameters and so on. So we can get control of all of that with the software tools. And this is one of the most iconic type of outputs that you get from the code. Over the summer, course of last year's summer, we were spending a lot of time plotting curves of a sort I'd never really done before, which are a bit gruesome. It shows the cumulative deaths predicted by this model as a function of days after the breakout of the pandemic. And the main things that are important here are to notice that this model is actually completely shot through with uncertainty. The baseline report 9 sample, which is the dashed orange line there, was the one thing that Neil Ferguson announced in report 9. But if you do a full-blown uncertainty analysis, those shades of kind of purple are confidence intervals for what you might get out of the model. On the right-hand side, a distribution, which is very skewed with a substantially thick tails to one side, which show that actually, if you look at the cumulative deaths, the probability of deaths that 5 to 10 times almost higher than what he predicted with a one-off simulation are all compatible with the model. And the data in green is the experimental information that was obtained after the event. There isn't a particularly good fit to that, which is a problem with it. This is the type of information you get from the Sobel sensitivity analyses of what's dominating, as it were, contributing most to the variance in that output, the cumulative death variance. And indeed, what this study shows is that of the order of 3 parameters here, the top 3 that are displayed in this plot are the ones that account for over 50% of the variance in the model. Most of the others then are rather small. So that's just giving you an idea of the sort of thing that you can do with such a model, that you have to understand that it's got a very high degree of uncertainty in it. And I haven't had time to dwell on this, but I should say the parametric uncertainty, which is when we vary the the parameters around some sort of mean value, the uncertainty that's transferred from input to output is of the order of a 300% magnification. So there's a big uncertainty amplification from input to output. The model does have 4 random seeds in it, which reflect something to do with the interactions between people in transmitting the disease, and also the setup of the network at the beginning, the spatial network. But it's interesting to note that the stochastic component there has much lower variance than the parametric variance does in this study. This is actually completely the converse to situations that I'm familiar with, for example, in molecular dynamics, or a code which is studying turbulence and, shall we say, chaotic intrinsic stochasticity, where we note quite often the opposite situation. It's the stochasticity and the aleatoric variation that's the largest contributes to uncertainty. And indeed, in some molecular dynamics codes, we see there's a deflation in the uncertainty from the inputs to the outputs. Let me quickly take you through other examples that are fashionable at the moment and relevant, in this case, to drug discovery. Google's DeepMind predicting protein structures. That's been something that's hit the news. Certainly, I've seen it in the UK, front page stuff like front page for COVID sim. We can now predict the folding of proteins using what's called AI methods. And the DeepMind team, in fact, did come from UCL Computer Science and got integrated into Google. So you may have noticed there was a lot of publicity around this some while back in the papers, but not long. I think it was maybe towards the end of last year. And the claimed discovery here, which hasn't fully been published and is not open yet, is that they've cracked the problem of predicting 3D crystal structures given primary sequence information. Experimentally, as you can see on this slide, there are 180 million known sequences of proteins in a protein database. But until now, only 170,000 protein structures, 3D ones. It's a tough problem to do the crystal structures and then the analysis. So if you can do this by machine learning and AI, it's going to be a tremendous help because it means that we predict the 3D structures, and from that, we don't have to do all the experimental work. We can start looking at how they, as the saying goes, dock ligands or compounds, and we can begin to do the hard work to determine whether we can design a drug. So it's a big deal in accelerating the speed of progress in drug discovery. That's what we're expecting. The work is based on just a huge amount of data, and also trying to structure the problem, looking at what we know of protein folding, the spatial graph, the amino acids, and how they're aligned with each other in space, and then designing a structure of a network to learn from this. So the claim is that it can do this very rapidly, and it's true as far as I can see, that in cases where it's working well, it's competitive with the best X-ray crystal structures in terms of the resolution of the structures that it can predict, which is of the order of 1.6 angstroms, if I remember correctly. So it's already being trumpeted as a great step forward. What I do notice, and do you remember what I was saying about the numbers of parameters in a model? If you had a scientific model in the sense of von Neumann or Fermi, and it had 5 parameters, you'd be wincing. Well, this model has something like 10 million parameters in it, and that's really because there are so many of these parameters in the neural network. So if you start looking at it like that, you may think it's not too surprising that you can get it to fit. It doesn't work well for nuclear magnetic resonance-based protein structure prediction, because the sort of whole methodology there is different from the one that produces crystal structures. NMR protein structures are more natural because they're recorded at ambient temperatures. Crystal structures come from freezing the protein into a very abiotic environment, so that they are very different in terms of the way that one would go about predicting things. And for those of you who know about RNA, it's become popular again because of things like the Pfizer vaccine. RNA structures are often three-dimensional. It's not going to work for that at this point because it's just simply not fixed up to handle. I'm going to move to the drug discovery point now. You've noticed, as we all have, that vaccines have been very amazingly rapidly developed in the case of COVID. The fastest, I think, a vaccine was sort of produced and authorized in the past was perhaps 5 years, but in this case, it seems to have taken less than maybe 5 months to get this stuff kind of working. It's not used any particular detailed sort of modeling and simulation methodologies. It's based on sequence information and targeting the sequence of the the spike protein in the COVID panoply of proteins that accompany it, and then building that into sort of surrogate entities that you can sort of put into cells and use to protect them, to help train their immune system to then recognize the S protein if it gets infected by the COVID-19 virus. This little set of slides is reminding us that for drugs, and I just mentioned drug design, if you remember with the AlphaFold case, if I asked you how many drugs, antiviral drugs have been uncovered so far for COVID-19, I don't know whether people in the audience have a view on this, but essentially the answer is next to none. And the question that I'm posing then is why. In the case of HIV, by the way, which is also a virus which caused a lot of problems, they've never developed a vaccine at all, but they were quite successful over many years in producing inhibitors that work against HIV. But at the moment, we haven't found anything for COVID-19 significantly, although people have come up with other types of drugs that attack secondary infections, such as dexamethasone, which has been found in a trial to work well for patients who require extra oxygen and so on. But that's, in a sense, opportunistic. It's what we call repurposing of existing drugs that have passed approval and then get tested in trials. What we're interested in doing, the work I'm showing you here, is finding a systematic way of doing drug discovery to help, if you could, at pandemic speed for COVID-19, but to increase the speed of drug discovery in general terms, catalyzed or by what we're facing with COVID-19. The reason is that it takes of order 10 years and between $1 and $3 billion currently to produce a single drug. And the industry as a whole is no longer making sort of profits out of its R&D. It's a loss-making endeavor. So they tend to not try and spend time discovering drugs, but getting biotechs to discover them, and then when they have, buying them out and integrating their products in their production works and so on. So what we'd like to have is a more efficient way of dealing with this. And the approach we're trying to adopt here is one which sort of happily combines the physics-based methods of regular simulation with machine learning. Time going on, I shall need to move through this rather quickly, but the idea I'm going to convey to you is that on the one hand, machine learning can do things in a sense cheap and cheerfully, assess the space of possible, the chemical space of the shapes of compounds very fast, but in order to then hone the search into one that actually yields productive drug candidates, we have to switch across to the more accurate physics-based methods. And so this is what these slides are showing, mentioning the machine learning capabilities, the ability to look at very huge libraries. Those libraries can sometimes be physical. There's a whole set of compounds that already exist, which may be good if they're already, let's say, FDA, EMA approved, or they can be virtual libraries. We can use all kinds of algorithms to try and discover these molecules, and we depend heavily on what we call training data in general. The molecular dynamics end of this is once you've got your three-dimensional structures depicted on the right here, you've got a particular geometric problem that in the first instance you're trying to fix up. How well does the shape of the small molecule fit into an active site or catalytic site, whatever it is, the key site in the protein. And to do those type of calculations correctly, you need to use quite accurate molecular dynamics type calculations. Relative to a machine learning algorithm, these types of calculations are expensive, and you can't possibly cover anywhere near the same degree of amount of space by using them. So in a project we've been working on with the DOE, why would we do this with the DOE? This goes back to Jim Biden, the Cancer Moonshot initiative he had while he was he promoted while he was the vice president under Obama. Now he's back in power as the president, as we know. He promoted the idea that surely all these powerful computers in the Department of Energy and their ability to process data should be combinable with medical challenges to crack those ones and find solutions. So the DOE has been working on cancer activities for a while. I collaborate with them. We've got a collaboration with them as an international partner in Comp Biomed. And when the pandemic came along, of course, they actually uniformly then also switched to starting to help to address that. And this is a workflow we've been developing with them, which is quite complicated, but it involves machine learning, docking, which is where you just put a molecule into an active site. And in fact, rather than actually do that, you can do very good machine learning to get docking scores. And then you can begin to build in the free energy calculations, which are done by the physics-based methods here. And the combination of these sequences of workflows is such that part of the calculation involves a combined machine learning and molecular dynamics technique, which is referred to down here as Deep Drive MD, which is a systematic way of using a sort of convolution variational autoencoder of the sort that's known well to many machine learners in combination with molecular dynamics to reduce the dimensionality of the MD and focus on the most important points. And we use that as a mechanism to try to probe better fits, you can call them, or docking poses from the initial ones we work with, even in the physics-based technique. And then we iterate this round. So we go from a coarse-grained MD to a fine-grained MD. And we're looking to, improve the selection. So the idea is shown in this slide that you can gradually get down to a very small number of compounds, the ones which you would like to be calling actionable, which are the ones you're going to do experimental tests on. Whereas today, the reason why it takes so long is there's an awful lot of experiments being done on all the candidate compounds, and then we try to whittle them down. And the modeling tends to be used retrospectively to justify the way you're choosing the compounds rather than driving it. Here's another area which is interesting. Changing field again, this is fusion energy. Well, this is obviously an important one to try and deal with aspects of our energy sources into the future. It can provide a carbon-free kind of solution to where we're getting our energy from and avoiding a lot of geopolitical problems. So as folks here may know, the big international site at Cadarache in southern France called ITER is under development. And people are currently trying to help to design the tokamak that will be in there by using modeling and simulation. This is another case where I'm trying to stress, if we can do the computations correctly and make our predictions reliably, then we can guide experiments in a more favorable way. So this is the sort of picture you get from an attempt to model a plasma, and even that is simplified and idealized. What you want to do, though, is to draw insights from ITER and use the modeling to optimize design of potential power plants in the future and to interpret reactor behavior and design. So these models are actually pretty complicated, more probably than the other ones I showed already, because they're intrinsically multi-scale. There's multi-physics involving microscopic processes and macro ones from the gyro rotations of the electrons in the plasma, the turbulence of the fluid, and some of the equilibrium assumptions that are made at other levels, all brought together. And the point here again is down at the bottom right, we need uncertainty quantification to be able to be reliably predicting what the outcomes are and that are things suitable to help with the design of the tokamak. Uncertainty quantification, verification, and validation. This is a complicated slide that shows some of the performance that's now coming out of predictions using uncertainty quantification with error bars on some of those simulations. And if you look carefully on the left-hand side, you can see quite a lot. The important thing to do is just look at the legend and see the Vecna toolkit is being used here to help to control the uncertainties in these calculations. And again, we won't go into the details of what's in the Vecna toolkit unless someone wants to know more. But these are large-scale computations that need lots and lots of nodes on supercomputers, for which we use things that I haven't mentioned before, such as pilot jobs that give you control of a whole area of the machine, for which you can run ensembles and workflows of the kind I mentioned, also for the drug discovery method. So there's a lot of generic capabilities that we're involved in developing. Vecna is designed to address many of the applications we've looked at here. In other words, it's meant to be agnostic with respect to the application domain in which we're working. And I think we've been able to show we can use it for epidemiology, for drug discovery, for fusion energy, and a number of other things as well. So one of the other things to mention, of course, is weather and climate. These are very important problems. Certainly climate, as we know, is one of the major issues facing us for the future. I just want to quickly take us through that. For weather forecasting, what's been happening in the last 25 years or so is ensembles have just kicked in as de rigueur, which means everyone uses them to make predictions, to get uncertainties and probabilities as indicated here, because you can start a whole set of simulations, typically around 50 will be launched by your meteorological office, and over the short term you'll see where they head. And they can go off in a range of different directions. And from that, as in COVID sim, you've got to then infer what the probability of things like rainfall is. So one of the doyens of this is Tim Palmer, who used to be at the Met Office and the ECMWF, which is in Reading and just outside London. An analysis of when you've got predictable behavior of these kind of weather systems and when they go into unpredictable states. These are quotes from one of his papers on this, which just indicates that one has to abandon in general a deterministic paradigm in order to be able to make weather forecasts realistically. But there's an idea of a deterministic limit here, which you can see for some sorts of studies and conditions may persist for a long period of time, but in other instances, that deterministic limit could be extremely short. And if you just run one simulation, you will become entirely unreliable in your predictions. So this is a picture of what happens when we take that challenge to the bigger one of climate change, where I think we all realize we're wrestling with the question of how do things like greenhouse gases, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, influence global surface warming temperatures? And these are just plots of scenarios that people have conducted by modeling and simulation. They do these things according to this so-called special report on emission scenarios from the International Panel on Climate Change. And what you clearly see is that you can get vastly different predictions of global surface temperatures over 100 years, depending on some of the as it were, the assumptions that or the parameters that you put into your models here. The one thing I'd like to draw your attention to on the right of that central graph are the uncertainties that accompany those lines which are predicting what the temperature would be. And that temperature might be a mean. If you look carefully at the mean, let's say the black line on the extreme right or any of the others in the center, you look carefully at that, you'll see that it's not the center of some beautiful normal distribution, far from it. It's typically a skewed distribution, non-normal and fat-tailed. The fat tail meaning there's quite a high probability of events occurring far out from the mean. And those things are the sort of scenarios which mean you could have a 10% chance of one of these sort of doom scenarios occurring with extremely high temperatures. And that's a high probability, which we are now wrestling with, dealing with, albeit it's so far into the distance that for many people, they might prefer to put their head in the sand. So I just want to conclude, in all of this, I've been talking largely about modeling with simulation involved, though you will have seen I'm keen on bringing the big data and AI into play. The challenge with just using big data is that it can miss out on things like the structural characteristics of the problem, and you could end up pursuing a lot of data scraping endeavors that take you nowhere very usefully. A problem that does crop up is often that the data that people work with are just picked up with no idea of how they're distributed. And if a problem is non-Gaussian, for example, you have this problem that the mean and the full distribution imply quite a high occurrence of outliers and so on, that if you don't think through properly, you will totally miss out of your ability to predict properly. So there's a whole range of things here which you need to be very careful about when you use big data methods. And I'm very much in favor of not using them except when they're connected to our understanding of the way the world works through, as it were, physical laws. This is something I've written about a few times in the past, and the papers at the bottom of these two slides just emphasize that. Time is flying, so I think I will just bring myself to a conclusion here for you, Mike, by summarizing, saying simulation-based science, if you're talking about the topic of my talk, the role of it for decision-making in healthcare, government, and industry, it's playing a role already. How effective it is, we could discuss and debate, but in some of the engineering areas, designing spacecraft, shall we say, that go to Mars and elsewhere, it's just part of the furniture in a way. Weather forecasting and climate science are among the forefront of people trying to work with these things. In other areas, it's growing in importance. And certainly the fusion area, which we've been working on, I've now got projects with our own UK Atomic Energy Authority that's trying to do things that I was describing from scratch, trying to design the structure of tokamaks or learn how to build nuclear power plants. You can't actually realize the reactor conditions you want now, but you've got to be able to do simulations that achieve it. How do we get to that point? There's three things I'm mentioning here. Obviously, we strive to have more accurate models, higher fidelity. I think typically complex problems imply models with large numbers of parameters in them, which are foreign to a certain category of scientists, but they're a challenge. And then we need to be able to quantify the uncertainties in these codes and simulations. And those two things themselves really need increasingly powerful supercomputers to support. So all of those things need to be in play to make our impact in the areas that I'm mentioning today increasingly significant. And with that, Mike, I want to stop and thank you all for your attention. I welcome a discussion on this. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Peter, for the excellent talk. So I'd like to open the floor to questions. I think the best way this can work is if you know how to raise your hand, try to raise your hand with Zoom, or drop a message in the chat, and then I'll go through it one by one. So Gabel, I saw you were very quick with the hand, and then Patrick.
Yeah, I try to be fast.
Oh, there you are, Gabel, yes.
Yes, thank you for the nice talk, Peter. Somewhere at the first half of it, you were talking about the COVID-19 model and how it has a quite large amount of parameters, 19 or so, I think. And then you showed a slide on the sensitivity analysis where 3 of those parameters were outliers in terms that they were much more sensitive. So my question would be that now what would you suggest to the development team, given this information? What should they do with their model to increase fidelity, for example?
Well, that's a nice question. Yeah, you're right. We identified 19 as the most important. You agree that I said originally there are 940, by the way, not 90, which is significant difference. But yes, what I didn't dwell on, but is mentioned in the paper, is that actually to get agreement with observation, it isn't sufficient just to deal with parametric uncertainty. We have two other categories of uncertainty that we need to worry about. One is what we call scenario uncertainty, the scenario in which we're using the model. And the second one is the model uncertainty itself, if you're following me. So it really is sending the message that that model as it stands is, you know, pretty crude, in my opinion. It doesn't have anywhere near enough in it to cope with the detail. You saw it doesn't validate very well. And so, you know, if you wanted to do better, one of the things that's reported in the paper that we published, I think at the beginning of this week, there is that you could try to retrofit the parameters onto data. There's a very limited amount, you'll understand. This model, as far as I know, I'm talking to Neil Ferguson, has only been used in the UK, right? And there's one event that occurs, and then you've got to compare against it. That's a weakness, obviously. But if you wanted to try and do better with the model, you might want to tweak the parameters in a reverse sense. So in some inverse Bayesian fashion in order to make it fit better. So that's a possibility, but it seems to me we don't have enough empirical data to do that at the moment. So the one evident observation that one could draw from weather forecasting is in the weather forecasting, let's say for the UK, nonetheless, the models that are used make extensive use of data globally. So all the data on weather in the world is used to make these models fit better. And then it's used in the UK. In the case of this epidemic with COVID sim and the pandemic, we've only used it, to my understanding, in the UK. Now, the model, I know, has in it the potential to be applied to many countries. There are versions of the parameters that Neil Ferguson explained to me we could use to fit data in France or perhaps in the Netherlands, but I've never seen anyone doing it. So it's one of these problems I think we face with complex systems, and that is that you have a huge number of parameters typically, and you're trying to fit a problem which is very complicated. And although we say we live in the era of big data, it seems to me there's never enough of that data to be able to cope with reliably fitting all the parameters in these models. Do you follow me?
Try to. All right. So, and I think I understand it. And in particular for this COVID model, I don't know the details, but I imagine that stochasticity in that model is present on multiple levels. My first intuition would be that, okay, if I can identify some of the parameters which are much more sensitive, probably those are not the parameters where introducing stochasticity is a good idea. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, just to remind you what I said, and I imagine you did hear me, we studied the effect of the random seeds. There are 4 places where random stochasticity is put into the model. And then there's all the parameters that we've got. Mm-hmm. And in the study, what we find is that the uncertainty generated by parameter uncertainty is far bigger than that generated by the random seeds. Mm-hmm. It's so small relatively that it was actually in the paper with the constraints on their pages, only in the supplementary information. So that's related to, a model that goes beyond what's called the law of mass action, which is deterministic between 2 entities coming together and maybe infecting each other. This has random elements for that. It also has random elements to define the network that you build. So indeed, some of the early models that he used in report 9 and so on, you could never rebuild the same model twice. So it was very difficult to achieve any level of reproducibility. But to come back to your point, that's where the stochasticity is currently. And the biggest source of uncertainty isn't in that, it's in the parameters. So he just quotes one number for a given parameter. Let's say a disease transmission parameter, one of the things I mentioned. You just get one number. No information is supplied about the distribution of that. So it's that when I said that criticizing big data studies, which I call distribution free, nobody knows what the distribution is. They just use the data that's in front of them. One number. How do you decide the uncertainty? For most cases, we did a choice of using uniform uncertainty between, say, plus or minus 20% around that. And the variation around that is what leads to this amplification of 300% in the outputs. But there's just very little information at all supplied there. I do know there are other models that have been published. This one is supposed to be quite a complicated and comprehensive one, but some other models for COVID-19 transmission, which are much more kind of scientifically attractive to someone doing uncertainty quantification, because they do give not just, say, a central value for a parameter, but they actually tell you what the distribution is, which would be more helpful.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Patrick.
Yes, thank you. Professor, I have a question about some of the work you did with the COVID simmer, I guess your opinions on it. And there you showed in the slides that you're basically inferring probability distributions on the outputs from the ensemble of runs, right? Now, to me, that makes sense for something like weather, right? Because, if we mess up our weather forecast because, the probabilities were not in our favor, that's fine. It just rains, even though I thought it would be a nice day. Now, if we're working on something like COVID, we can't really afford that, right? Because the consequences of getting something like COVID wrong are quite substantial. So is it appropriate to use these probability distributions for making decisions?
I actually think it definitely is. It sounds like you don't like the idea that we should have them. Let me just put words into your mouth. It sounds like you regard that as inimical, whereas I'm saying it's an intrinsic aspect of reality, effectively, that this is just, there's a lot of uncertainty in the nature of the model. So weather forecasting produces many potential outcomes. So too does an epidemiological simulation, because it's actually this type of model is very coarse-grained. It doesn't give you a lot of detail at all. It's dealing with, call it macroscopic averages rather than the microscopic detail. So if you really wanted to be thoroughly correct medically and so on, you'd need to have microscopic models for the mechanism for how things transmit and so on. For example, there's a latent period. That thing is one parameter in the model that's like intrinsic to the nature of the disease. We can't control it, but there are all these other things that are interventions we can put in. But they're still being described at some sort of average level, roughly in physics language, like a mean field level, and there could be a lot of variation. Indeed, we actually know that's the case under the hood here, right? Because there are things like super spreaders and people who do things that perhaps the models are going to get refined as we know more about these features that just aren't in these models. So, I sign up quite firmly to using ensembles for these systems, because they give you an ability to probe the level of uncertainty in the model as a whole.
Okay. No, I certainly agree that ensembles are important. I just don't know whether inferring probability distributions from those ensembles makes sense, because there's so many levels of uncertainty going into those ensembles of model runs that the output is, like, who knows how good it is. But, okay, thank you very much.
Okay, but in the protocols we've got, yeah, we're varying all the parameters and we're predicting the distribution that we get from it. So it's as good as we think we can get from these type of calculations.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Anyone?
if no one's got a question, I'm still keen to know if anyone's doing this sort of modeling in the Netherlands or somewhere else in Europe, or did they decide that this is ridiculous, it's not good enough, we're not going to bother with this? Do you have any comments on this?
I don't know if anyone here is working with the guys at RIVM, but I know there are groups, quite well-known epidemiologists in the Netherlands who've done modeling, a few in Utrecht, a few in Leiden. I don't know what model they're using at RIVM to make these predictions. I don't know how they're doing it.
And has it had an impact on policy in the way that became very clear?
Yeah, so I don't read Dutch, so it's hard for me to say, but maybe one of the Dutch speakers. I don't think we have a Neil Ferguson in the Netherlands. Maybe one of the Dutch people can. Is there a figurehead for the modeling of epidemiology in the Netherlands? It's been on the TV a lot. No, right. That's what that was. So not in the same way, I think. Not in this kind of. Claudia, you have a question, maybe a comment.
Yeah, no, it's the question, but it's not to answer your question that you just asked. So yeah, I have a question regarding actually what Gabor asked earlier and your answer to his question. So you said that there were not enough data to obviously fit all the 900 parameters and even the 60 parameters that when you did your reduction. I'm wondering if, I mean, from the analysis you just showed us, you identify like 7 parameters that are very important for the system. And so would it be enough data to, for example, fit those 7 parameters? And then, you know,
no, it is definitely the case. That's one of the advantages of doing a sensitivity analysis and then uncertainty quantification, that it tells you which are the ones that matter most. Of course, it's still inside a model that's, you know, from my point of view, it has shortcomings. We could make better models than we have, but every time you improve the model, you know, the bad news is you're going to have new parameters to include. So both things are true. If you want to just work with this model, then yes, it's telling you which things to concentrate on to do better. But it's still, remember what I said, that just the parametric uncertainty actually isn't sufficient to capture the variance in the actual data. You need to have a so-called scenario uncertainty nailed down as well, which isn't clearly defined in the models. So and that's what ends up leading you to try to retrofit. People have tried to retrofit COVID sim parameters to data that they've had after the event in order to get parameters that they can then say work. But those are just not going to work for another scenario because they weren't fitted for it.
Yeah, obviously. What do you mean by retrofit? Sorry.
Well, it means, so the whole point about what we're talking about with uncertainty quantification in these contexts is, as a simulation-based science seminar and community, I think, at least for this, I'm advocating that we should be developing high fidelity models that make predictions. Those predictions are actionable because they're equipped with tight error bars and so on. And therefore we don't have to keep making measurements to know what to do, obviously. But so we want forward predictions with credibility to take actions. Retrofitting means I'll get the experimental data and then I'll tune the model so that it agrees with the experimental data. Do you follow? So then you can go away saying, my model now works for this scenario. But I'm actually trying to tell you that it won't work, unfortunately, even if you do that for the next scenario, because there are model scenario issues there that aren't being captured in that work.
Sure, yeah. So I'm just wondering is that if in general, if you really want to be able to predict what's going to happen with high fidelity, then you actually need really a lot of data of a system that doesn't change. And it might seem unfeasible here because the system constantly changes. We have mutation of viruses, we have the law changes, and So I don't know if it is actually, I mean, this is a question actually, is it feasible to think that you will be able to collect enough data of a system that kind of is always the same, such that you will be able to predict what will happen before the system change?
Yeah, that's a big issue and challenge, depending on the degree of complexity of the system you're looking at. Like an evolutionary system genuinely evolving in time, are you going to be able to keep track of everything that's happening there, the contingencies in it? That's the sort of hardest thing you could possibly do. But in a sort of scientifically controlled way, you can imagine a thought experiment, at least, which says, here's this scenario here. Maybe I was suggesting something like this from the international dimension. Let's not just use the UK's data, which is very thin on the ground, it only happened once, but gather all the information we can globally for those events, and then develop a model that's robust against all of that. Do you see?
Yeah. But I would imagine somehow that this model will have some ingredients that are valid for all countries and some ingredients that are different, that differ from one country to another. So
there would be, and indeed vaccination has come along, which wasn't relevant then. There are parameters in COVID sim that are meant to handle, you know, how you vaccinate people and the impact that that has on them. So, you know, vaccination, you could just say, oh yes, I've got a parameter for vaccination. No, you haven't. You've got maybe the dreaded AZ vaccine or the Pfizer one and some other one. They're all different. And oh my goodness, there's this mutation aspect that's now creeping in that just wasn't sort of there in the first instance. So it is getting increasingly complicated, yes.
So Peter, maybe I can ask a question. I have two questions actually. One was a technical. Sorry, Vitor. I jumped ahead. On one slide, you show these sensitivity parameters for the COVID thing, and I think, and I assume most of the VECMA stuff is global sensitivity analysis. So you get total order and first order kind of sensitivities.
Yeah.
And there was one parameter, or one parameter that mentioned, I think, something about the transmissions within a household as being the most sensitive, which I found quite remarkable. So that's my first question. Do you have any reflection on that? And the second question is about, you know, the traditional purpose for, let's say, sensitivity analysis is to reduce parameters in your model. Well, one, you know, you can throw away things. The other one is to help guide data collection. So if you know that this is the most sensitive thing, then it could be that, okay, you measure this in reality as close as you can to actually reduce the sensitivity, thereby getting a better estimate of what that parameter should actually be, thereby getting a better model. So the first question is the reflection on that household thing. And the second one is, are these results of yours now being used to help the government measure these parameters?
The question about the sensitivity of household things, do you remember, there are surprising things that come out there. People didn't know what the parameters, the most dominant ones, would be. I don't think we claimed to know until we found them come out of the model. So I'm not sitting here like an oracle saying, oh yeah, I know why that is. I'm not sure that it's totally obvious at all to me. But it's one thing that you then learn, as you said, that the model that has in it, and you can that's good. That's something you can actually act on, right? Like you could be not a Neil Ferguson and comply with the quarantine rules, and that was one of the important ones as well. Yeah. So you can learn from that. You can try to ask more questions about it, and I totally agree with you. As far as possible, yes, we'd like to reduce the number of variables in it. Indeed, this is something Wouter himself is doing quite a bit on now, so-called sort of deep active subspaces in the models that tell you ways of trying to deal with uncertainty quantification without actually even starting with all the parameters in play, and then surrogate models that go around that. So this is important. However, I think I'm trying to say the model is, in many respects, in my mind, quite a simple one. And so I'm not thinking it's captured everything anyway, and therefore I should be content to just hone in on what this model is telling me. No, I'm worried about other things, some of which are to do with parameters or processes that weren't in it, clearly are now. As regards its impact on government decision-making, I think one thing I have to say is, in the last few months, I have not noticed this model being held up as the one thing we should work with. Neil, I mean, it's slightly awkward position I was in, because I couldn't have undertaken this work with the team if I hadn't been able to work with Neil Ferguson, who at the moment I was approaching him had actually had his name, dragged across the front pages of the newspapers. So he had to know that I was doing this seriously, but I had to do it objectively and not in collaboration with him. So we worked with him on understanding the model, and he was really good about providing the information. But at the end, we have to write a paper, which is what we found. I don't think he necessarily was that ecstatic about the fact that we were effectively making some criticisms of it. And his defense is, well, now what we do is we just pool a lot of different models together and we take the average of those, sort of thing, which is his way of claiming that's how they've evolved it. I feel slightly uncomfortable about that if the approach he was adopting before was just the one-off run of the simulation. I need to know the statistical properties of his model and then that of other ones to be able to start bringing them together.
Okay, Vitor.
Just two questions. The first one has to do with, okay, you've identified these 7 or whatever, a small number of important parameters. And I was curious about exactly the opposite. So what are the useless things that, because it's really, I feel like everyone has this idea, oh no, this thing is really important. We should really do this thing. So I feel like super important also for policy is what doesn't matter. And I was wondering if you have a list of that.
Well, if you look at the paper, I've got it right down there. One of the, maybe, I'm not going to show it again, but in fact, one of the slides I put up, which we could look at again, is slide 4. And it shows among the what led to the 7, the examples of things that didn't come into play here. Duration of case isolation is one case. Length of time that households are quarantined isn't relevant. Relative spatial contact rates by age. Residual place contacts after household quarantine. Relative rate of random contacts if symptomatic. Relative household contact rate after closing. I mean, I think it's possible to try to give qualitative explanations for things like this once you know which ones dominate.
Yeah.
But forward prediction is not obvious.
Okay, so that's interesting. The I guess a related question is that also has to do with how the model is built. Does the model have parameters? Because you could imagine like these parameters are not important because you have others that capture that in more detail, or in a better way or whatever. So I was thinking, okay, do you classify these parameters in kind of like behavior? Do you have behavioral parameters there for how people respond to number of cases, or like, do you have parameters for sorting in the sense that
not like that?
If I'm a risk-seeking person, then I'm more likely to go to the cafe shops and
no,
so.
I don't think so. But the one that I was pointing to repeatedly was, household level compliance with the quarantine, which does suggest a recognition that people may do things that they're not told to do. And there are aspects like that.
Yeah, but I guess what I was trying to get at is that, okay, you have this level of compliance, but maybe what it's driving it is maybe the response of some people to, it's like the slope of that with regards to number of cases or risk perception or things like that. So yeah, if it would be interesting to see, like, if a parameter becomes irrelevant once you have another one, and I don't know if there's any kind of analysis that gives us that kind of information.
All I know is that when we first looked at this thing with what came out to be 19 parameters from our sensitivity analysis, initially we picked 20, but it turned out from some debate that one of those parameters was, there was a strong argument to say that you actually couldn't vary that particular parameter at all. So we effectively had to redo our analysis without including that one, for reasons to do with whatever you call it, the epidemiological considerations. It actually didn't make any significant difference to the results in general terms, but there were some quantitative shifts.
And I guess the second question, if I still have time, the second part of my question, which was related to, I guess, this comment of, having the distributions, and I completely agree with you that, yeah, we should have the distributions, and it's better than just ignoring them. But a related question is, how do you see the usage of this distribution? Because, of course, maybe we don't want to take a kind of a risk-neutral approach and just take, okay, I'm going to look at the mean of this distribution and just think about, minimizing costs based on the mean of the distribution or whatever. Yeah. Maybe I can do something which is look at the worst case scenarios and try to avoid those. But we also know that in the limit, the worst case scenario will be, infinite number of deaths or something like that.
Yes, but I think,
so how do you balance those?
I think I put one thing I mentioned in the climate case was this book. I don't know if you can see it. Is that visible? It's called Climate Shock. It's from 2015 by Gernot Wagner and Martin Weitzman. And the interesting thing about this is, and by analogy, and it may help me to answer your question, is this is talking about the uncertainties in climate prediction, right? They make no bones about the fact that it's highly uncertain, but the uncertainties are still sort of calculable within error bars, etc. And the point, I think I tried to say it in the talk where I was talking about those non-normal distributions, is that they mean that there's a significant probability of perturbations of temperatures in that case that are up to 10 degrees or more. And a point they make in that book is, in that case, like many models suggest that there's a 10% chance of that from the distributions, the fat-tailed nature of those distributions. And they put it to me or you or the reader that if you had a 10% chance of your own savings being stolen or something, you do something about it, because that's quite a high risk. And that's also true for accidents, the rest of it. But it doesn't seem that we take this seriously when it's climate prediction sort of safely off into the distance. And it's a global concern that everyone should be worried about. So that sort of thing transferring into the epidemiological context, I think you can see what I'm getting at there.
Yeah, and I completely agree that that's exactly why the distribution is so useful, right? That you can look at these extreme events and quantify, like.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, is there any more questions before we let Peter off the hook? No? Well, Peter, once again, I think this is one of our best attended talks of the year so far. And it was really a great talk. I think exactly what I was hoping for and more. So thanks very, very much. We'll put the video online and we'll send you the link. If you could send the slides, that would be great.
I will do that, yes.
And hopefully when we go back to being physical again, you can give another talk in EOS and meet everyone.
I'd like to do that. And do you have any idea when that sort of rosy scenario will come to play? In the Netherlands, what's it looking like at the moment?
I think the uncertainty quantification is quite high. We are. There was a route. We were supposed to come out of lockdown on the 2nd of March, but now that's been extended. The primary schools are open again, and I think the high schools will open again sometime in the next couple of weeks. But we are flatlining in terms of cases. So it's 3,000 a day. It's been like that for quite a while. The good news is that there's not that many people in the Netherlands. So if we keep that rate up, then by the time in a year or so, we should be okay.
Yeah.
But we are, as you probably are fully aware, we are a little bit behind in terms of the vaccinations. And because the UK somehow renegotiated on the deal. So I hope that the summer brings a better situation. We were having a discussion with the organizers that maybe in May, late April, we can hope that we do a physical, at least partially physical, partially.
Right.
Yeah. The only thing for you is that you have to kind of figure out whether the quarantine is necessary.
Well, all of those factors are still there, aren't they, at the moment? That's true.
Yeah. Yeah, unless the UK improves a lot in the next few months, I think you're not going to be on the favourable list for the Dutch immigration.
Yeah. Let's not rub our noses in that. Difficult.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I hope we can see you in EOS again.
I'm hoping that will happen soon.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks again. And
Thank
I'll see
you.
Yeah. See the rest of you in a week or so.
Take care, guys.
Thanks a lot, Peter.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.